My name is Thomas Lapiana. I'm a senior software engineer at Ethica. Thank you for being here on the final session of the first day. I'm sure you're all exhausted, but we're going to talk about the most exciting thing, which is data privacy compliance. So really quick, we're going to speed run modern privacy regulations. That's going to give us kind of a nice set stage for when we talk about how open source tools can help you stay compliant. So really quick, there are 30 plus countries across the world, and that is actually including the EU as a single entity. So we're looking at almost 60 countries with data protection laws. 6 US states have already passed privacy legislation. You'll probably know CCPA in California. Florida has their own, Texas passed their own, and there are 20 more states on the way. So data privacy is getting more complex by the day. There are all these different rules for all these different places, and it's becoming more and more critical to stay on top of things. So generally, what do these laws require? These are kind of the 7 foundational tenets of GDPR. I'm not going to go into each one, but this is what's listed on their website as kind of the main things to remember. And even though not all privacy laws are exactly this, they're pretty similar. It was kind of a, we're going to copy your homework, but like change it a little bit situation, where they're all generally similar to this, but with a few changes here and there. Practically, for engineers, for technology companies, this comes down to what I call the triumvirate of compliance. So how do we stay compliant with generally what those 7 tenets require? So number 1 is going to be data subject request processing. It's going to be DSR from here on out. So you've probably heard of like the right to be forgotten, the right to erasure. You've got the right to access, so being able to see what data a company has about you. Second is a ROPA. That's like the legalese record of processing activities. Some people just call it a data map. You need to be able to tell the regulators every year what are you doing with whose data and what is your legal grounds for doing so. You have to be able to explain this to regulators. And then finally, we have consent tracking. I'm sure you all remember a few years ago, the internet got even more annoying because every website you go to now has a pop-up and you have to click a thing that says, okay, you can use my data, or no, I don't want you to use my data. And you need to actually track that. So when a user comes to your website, they're now generating data that you're probably storing, and you actually need to respect their wishes in terms of consent all throughout the life cycle of the data. So organizations, in some cases, are trying to comply with all these things. And from what we've seen, a lot of companies are relying on manual processes. So this basically just ends up being a bunch of interns or a bunch of data engineers running SQL queries. They're logging into APIs. They're sending emails manually. And it's not scalable. It gets really expensive. And there's no one to make coffee because the interns are all busy handling data subject requests. Next, you have some companies are just kind of accepting that it's too complex and it's too expensive. And they're just going to say, okay, we're going to be out of compliance. We know that it's a risk, but it's a risk we're going to take because the alternative is just too difficult. And then finally, there are vendors. There are people out there buying their solutions and adopting them. But again, to be truly compliant, you have to cover data throughout the entire life cycle. So it's not just our data warehouse is covered, so we're good there, or it's not just, okay, we have a cookie consent banner on our web page. Everything needs to be working together. The data subject requests need to get processed against the data warehouse and the application database. So it's a lot more complex than just usually a single solution can provide. So to sum up, an ideal way to solve this problem is to have a single tool that can do automated DSR processing, right? So give the interns a break. There's not enough of them on Earth to handle all these requests. Automated data mapping, so some kind of tool that can go in, figure out where your data lives, what it's doing there, why it's being used, et cetera. And then finally, a dark pattern free that's very specific because people are actually getting caught on this, a dark pattern free consent flow. So people need to be able to visit your website, they need to be able to give consent, and that needs to be stored and used later when processing DSRs, et cetera. So this is the ideal state, right? So we've got software engineers and privacy professionals working together to achieve privacy compliance, because just like security, it's not something that a single team or a single group of people can solve within a company. You have potentially a compliance team or privacy engineering team, and they're there to set guidelines, and they're there to make recommendations and work with people, but they need the synergy of all the other teams to really make this work. And that's why it's really important that a tool also includes software engineers as part of that, because ultimately, we're the ones building the software, or data engineers, we're the ones building the software that's using this data, and we know it better than a privacy engineer is going to know it. Okay, so we're going to enter Fides, which is the open source privacy as code platform that we're going to talk about today that's aiming to solve some of these problems. All of these problems, in fact. So what is it? First off, it's pronounced Fides, and it's from the goddess of trust in Roman mythology. Our company name as well, Ethica. Earlier I called it a triumvirate, a lot of Greco-Roman themes going on here. And it's a platform, an entire platform, not just like a single application. It's a platform for building and maintaining privacy-respecting software. That means it's going to cover the software development life cycle itself. So from the engineering stage through to the CI stage, all the way into runtime applications. It's built by privacy experts, so it is fully open source, but it's being backed by a private company full of engineers and compliance experts who understand this kind of stuff, because it is really complicated. And then finally, as I had mentioned earlier, you have to be able to cater to different personas. You need to have software engineers working with privacy engineers, working with compliance professionals, potentially even then working with security professionals. So we have a CLI for maintaining privacy at development time. We have an API for configuration and execution. And then we have a UI for privacy administration during runtime. So we're catering to all these different personas in a single application, single platform. Now we're going to hop into a demo. So here we've got the Fides command line spun up. It is in Python, so it's pip installable. If you want to as well, you can use it via Docker container. So anytime you pip install Fides, you're going to get this handy command that'll give you a good idea of what Fides is capable of. So Fides deploy up, it's going to require that you have Docker Compose installed as well. And then what it's going to do is it's going to spin up an entire sample application that's going to show you the flow of evaluating your privacy policies against your code, as well as what happens when a user wants to submit a privacy request. And real quick, I'll show you what that looks like. So in these YAML files, this is kind of a thing we call Fides lang. And this is the foundation of Fides. This is expressing privacy as code. So we have systems, we have things like data sets. We've created all of these kind of prerequisite primitives that you need to be able to talk about privacy in a way that's applicable to code and then scalable as metadata. So here we have systems that can be a microservice, that can be a specific functionality within a microservice. We have data sets. So, okay, our Redis cache, we need to know what data is stored in there because there might be a PII. In our application database, we need to know everything that's in there. We need to know what types of data is in there. And then we have our policies. So this is basically a privacy policy codified in Fides lang that we're going to be able to run evaluations against. So when you run Fides deploy up, you're going to get greeted by this nice web page that opens locally. So the few different things we can play around with. First, I'm going to jump into the CLI demo. So when you run Fides push, which is a CLI command, it's going to take all of those YAML metadata files that I showed you before, and it's going to push them up to the server. This is pretty closely based off of like kubectl, kubectl, whatever you might want to call it. It's meant to be a very familiar interface where you've created everything as YAML files locally, and then it's getting pushed and stored in a centralized server. So now if I do a Fides evaluate, it's going to take that codified privacy policy that I showed earlier, and it's going to check everything that I've declared in my systems and my data sets and make sure that I'm not breaching that policy in any way. I can come back over here and I've added this privacy declaration in here. So that's saying I've added some kind of functionality to my system. I've come in here and I've added it as an additional privacy declaration saying, okay, I'm also using this data for this reason with this data subject and this qualifier. So if I do that, we now have something that breaches our privacy policy, and the evaluation is going to come up as a fail, and you're going to see what that looks like. So this is something that would run in CI, or it could even run as a Git hook before the developer pushes, and this basically means that you can catch privacy failures before they even get to production, right? Because again, just like with security, if the security flaw makes it into production, it's still an incident, right? You haven't truly stopped it from happening. So the first kind of protection here is Fides will help you at development time avoid some of these issues. What happens after you deploy your application though, right? So I'm going to come, we have a nice sample application here, Cookie House. So say I'm a user, it's my cheat day, we're not counting calories, so I'm just going to come over here, I'm going to buy the triple pack. Okay, so now we're going to buy some cookies. Awesome. So we've got this privacy center down here. This is something that gets deployed along with your code, and this is the key way in which your users are going to interact with Fides from a privacy perspective. So they come here. Even though this is themed like the website we were just using, this is actually something you would deploy from Fides. So we can do our data access, we can do our data erasure, we can also manage our consent. So I can come over here to manage consent. I can give them my email, right? So that's my primary identifier. That's how the system knows who I am, because I made my order with that email, that ID. And now, okay, because I'm using this browser, it's detecting global privacy control. It's automatically opted me out of data sales and sharing, email marketing, but product analytics is okay. That's perfect, because that's what I've set my browser to allow. Now I'll come in here and do an access request. So I ordered my cookies, they were delicious, but now I'm kind of curious what this company has on me. Okay, so this is what we call the admin UI. This is where the compliance team, the privacy professionals, potentially the privacy engineers would come to interact with the system. So what's nice is that the engineers are interacting with Fides in a very engineering type way, right? They're using the CLI, they're writing YAML files. That's something that engineers just are inherently used to doing these days. And so they don't really feel any extra friction when they do those things. Yes, it's extra steps, but it's not like they're having to go learn a new tool that they're completely unfamiliar with. Likewise, we're not forcing compliance professionals, lawyers, or privacy engineers to go and learn to use a CLI or to go and learn to write YAML files. They're able to come in here and use the UI, something that they should already be familiar with, to then ingest that information. So I'm going to just toggle this. Okay, so I can see, as you just saw, I submitted an access request. It's going to show up here in the Privacy Center. I can approve it. And then in production, depending on what you've set up, usually it's S3, that would actually go to an S3 bucket. The user would be sent a link and they'd be able to download it. Additionally, over here in data mapping, we have a view of all of our systems. Because again, we've defined everything as metadata, and now we're able to say, hey, we know these are our systems, we know what the uses are. And we can then drill in and see exactly what's going on there. So this is really important for anyone that's had to do any kind of auditing around privacy. We have everything in here that you need to be compliant. Okay, so that's Fides in a nutshell. That's covering how we maintain privacy during the software development life cycle, and then that's maintaining how users interact with Fides and how that eventually gets back to your admin UI, where you can then do those erasures, do those access requests, and maintain that user's privacy throughout the entire application, including the data warehouse. So we have connectors that can talk to your data stores, and that includes third-party APIs as well, because that also falls under it. So like under Connection Manager, you can see, so this sample application has a Mongo database and it has a Postgres database. And we're connected to both of those, and we're able to go find that Thomas at Ethica.com and remove it or grab it from all of those places. And we understand the execution graph of how that should be run. Because for instance, if you're running an erasure, you don't want to mess up a foreign key relationship or anything of that nature. So again, we're actually building a graph and understanding what order we should execute everything in to make sure we don't mess things up. So, quick summary. Data compliance is really, really hard, and it's not a simple or a solved problem. Maybe some people sitting in the audience right now have just come to the realization that they're probably not compliant. Don't worry, that's normal. It's really difficult. Because you need to handle the DSR processing, you need to handle the consent tracking, you need to handle data mapping, and potentially more things, right, as more regulation is added. And as they're even slightly different depending on each spot. Something I didn't even get into was you also need to look at geography when doing some of these things. So for instance, if you are in California and you go to that privacy consent center that I just showed you, you're going to have a different experience than if you're in a different state or you're in Europe, because we actually tailor it to each geographic location. That's important. And again, I think most companies actually are solving this by simply being non-compliant and just hoping they can wing it or get away with it or not get caught. So a lot of people that come to us and want help implementing Fides are companies that are just not compliant. We're not replacing some kind of existing solution, they're just not compliant in the first place. And additionally, the ones that do come to us that already have some kind of data compliance tool, it's not holistic, right? Because there are some really fantastic tools for, say, okay, let's do data governance and lineage throughout our data warehouse, but okay, what about the application database? Or what about when a user visits your website, how are you recording what their consent is and then tying that through your entire data lifecycle, which is more than just a data warehouse. Well, lucky for you all, Fides does it all, and you're welcome. No, we're always working on it. We're always trying to evolve it. But again, that's kind of the benefit of Fides, is you get privacy experts, right? We do this day in and day out, building this fully open source project. Recently, actually, the Python Software Foundation contributed to Fides and is now implementing Fides as part of all of the infrastructure of the Python Software Foundation. So in the near future, even using something like pip will actually be talking to Fides in the background, which has been really exciting for us. And in summation, why Fides does it all is because we have a solution for the DSRs, the data mapping, the user-facing privacy center, and enforcing compliance at development time. Quick appendix for any links. So first, docs.ethica.com. You can go there to learn all about Fides. Anything else you might want to know, we have a lot of tutorials on there. If you want to play around with the demo that I did, the Fides deploy up, it will have instructions on that as well. It's just a pip install Ethica Fides. We also have links to Fides and Fides Lang on GitHub. Get both of those completely open source. Contributions welcome. We interact with the community quite a bit. And then finally, for some, I guess, self-promotion, I was recently on an episode of the Talk Python to Me podcast, episode 409. And if you just want to hear me talk about data, I'd be flattered. You can go listen to that. We get into a lot more than just Fides. We just talk about data privacy as a whole, compliance, and how it affects us as software engineers and innovators and entrepreneurs. So that's all I have for everyone. Thank you.